Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first keynote, Justin Lee. As the founder of the online gay Christian network, and more recently as the author of Torn, Rescuing the Gospel from the Gays versus Christians debate, Justin has emerged as one of the foremost voices urging those of us within church communities to understand, love, and live with those who think differently than we do, as well as to educate people about what it means to be both gay and Christian. And while I could go on and list all of the wonderful things that people have said about Justin, you can actually read some of these things in your program. Instead, we thought it might be interesting to you to know on a more personal level how it was that these particular speakers this weekend came to our attention. My first introduction to Justin was actually through a parody musical called Straight to Heaven that Justin starred in the 2007 GCN conference. I saw the video online and pretty much laughed until I cried. When the idea for this conference came around, Torn had not yet come out, but Justin was already on our radar. We knew that his story, the faithful conservative Christian who is suddenly confronted with their own sexuality and has to figure out where they fit in the church and the world, is the story of many of us and many of our students. We knew that his voice would set the right tone for the space we wanted to create here. And we were really excited when he accepted our invitation. So if you would, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Justin Lee.
No, I'm not going to sing. Dude, one sentence in and I'm already getting booed. What's that about? Also, Chad, if I could trouble you at some point and get some water. I was looking around for some. I tried to motion to him a minute ago that I might like to have some water, and I think maybe he thought that I was saying that I was drunk, so I... So, yeah, gosh, so many things I want to tell you. But first, let me just give you a little history about me. My name is Justin Lee, as you have heard. I grew up Southern Baptist, so very conservative evangelical in the South. I still live in the South. I live in Raleigh, North Carolina, where the Gay Christian Network is headquartered. And let's see, I'm a Christian, grew up Southern Baptist. Oh yeah, the other obvious thing, I'm bald. And I actually have a genetic autoimmune disorder called alopecia areata. I first lost my hair when I was 4, so I've been kind of rocking the bald look for a while. Thank you so much. Been kind of rocking the bald look for a while, which is always fun. I mention it only because it always seems to come up at some point. People begin to realize I don't have any eyebrows, and at some point when I'm speaking, somebody always notices and I start getting this look from them. So I just bring it up right off the bat and let you know, yeah, my hair comes and goes, I keep it shaved, and then of course people always have questions and they're embarrassed to ask, and I'm not embarrassed, so I don't mind telling you because the next question is always the same, so I'll just go ahead and say it. Yes, in fact, people do often confuse me for Whoopi Goldberg. Super embarrassing when somebody comes up to me on the street and says, I loved you in Sister Act. And then I have to say, well, actually, thanks. Do you want me to autograph something? But I've been speaking for a while on this subject, and I do this not because I'm gay, but because I love the church. I care about the church. I care about the church a lot. A few years ago, I went to a Subway, the sandwich shop, and I got my sandwich, my drink, I sat down, I was starting to eat my sandwich, and I happened to glance down at my receipt, and at the bottom of my Subway receipt, it said, and I promise you I am not making this up, no returns, refunds, or exchanges after 30 days. Now, think about that with me for a moment, if you will. I wondered in what circumstances they would feel the need to have this on the receipt. I considered bringing the sandwich back half-eaten 29 days later just to see what they would say. But no, obviously, they were using a generic kind of credit card machine, and no one had noticed, or else knew how to fix it, that this was a problem. And I think it is so often that it's our friends, it's the people who are close to us who will bring our attention to the things that need to be fixed. You know, it's not the stranger who will tell you these things. It's your friend who will say, hey, you're looking a little ridiculous right now. It's your friend who says, hey, you've got spinach in your teeth. Or, hey, your fly is open. Or, hey, you've got spinach in your fly. Or whatever. I mean, clearly there's more going on there, but I love the church, and that's part of why I feel called to speak out and to say to the church, hey, there's a problem. There are things we need to fix because we, as Christians, have a really bad reputation in American society today. I don't know if you've noticed. Many of you have probably heard about the study that the Barna Group did a few years back. They surveyed Americans between the ages of 16 and 29, and they looked specifically at groups that they called the churchgoers, the active, church-going young Christians, and the outsiders, basically the non-Christians. And what they did was they gave these young folks a series of words and phrases that could describe a faith movement, some of them positive, some of them negative. Things like teaches good values, or gives hope, as well as things like hypocritical and judgmental. And they said, which of these words and phrases best describes modern Christianity? And out of all of these, none of the ones on the screen were the number one choice of these young folks. The number one choice was anti-gay. Actually, it was anti-homosexual, but that's too many letters, to fit on the slide. Anti-gay. This was the number one response. How popular was this response? Well, 91% of the non-Christians said that Christianity is anti-gay. You can't get 91% of people to agree on anything in a survey. You couldn't get 91% of people to agree that the sky is blue. But 91% of people of outsiders agreed that Christianity is anti-gay. And 80% of the churchgoers. That's 4 out of 5. That's the number of dentists who recommend the recommended brand. This is a problem. And for those of us who self-identify as Christians, as well as for those of us who believe that the church can do good in society, even if you're not a Christian, if you believe that religion has a practical purpose in society, that the church has a place, that the church could be doing a lot of good things, caring for those who are down on their luck, being there as a support system for those who are hurting, who are experiencing loss and tragedy, who are living in poverty, who are dealing with all these kinds of life problems. If you believe that the church has the ability to do those good things, this should bother you. Growing up, I was a teenage homophobe. I would have told you that was not the case. I would have told you that I was a good Christian and that I was standing for what good Christians ought to stand for. But I was the kind of obnoxious kid, okay, kind of might be stretching it. I was the obnoxious kid in high school who had a Bible in my backpack and a bunch of tracts and was ready to witness to anyone at any time. Maybe some of you knew that kid in high school. If so, I apologize. Maybe some of you were that kid in high school, in which case, hey. I believed it was my responsibility as an evangelical to speak out on the important and controversial issues of the day, and I did so. I did so with great fervor and intending to be loving. I didn't realize at the time how obnoxious I came across, partly I think because I grew up in a culture that taught me a lot of bad lessons about what it was to be a Christian. I mean, I grew up in this conservative, evangelical Christian bubble. I listened to Christian music. We didn't listen to secular music, no. We listened to Christian music. We read Christian books. I wore Christian t-shirts all the time. I played Christian video games. This is real. This is a thing. Did you know there were Christian video games? Some of you knew. Yeah, there was a video game I played growing up called Spiritual Warfare. Right? Okay, so when I was a kid, back when I was a little boy, we had the original Nintendo Entertainment System. One of the games that was very popular on the original Nintendo was a game called The Legend of Zelda. Some of you may be familiar with it. A few of you are, okay. This is a long-running series, but this was like the very first Legend of Zelda. Those of you who know it, you know that overhead view, and you're going in and out of caves, and yeah, okay. Spiritual Warfare was basically an exact copy of that game, with a few tweaks. In The Legend of Zelda, you are on a quest to save a princess. In Spiritual Warfare, you're on a quest against the powers of darkness, like you do. And in The Legend of Zelda, you collect weapons that can aid you in your quest. In Spiritual Warfare, you collect the fruits of the Spirit. Only they're actual fruits, like apples and bananas and pomegranates. In The Legend of Zelda, your enemies are monsters. In Spiritual Warfare, your enemies are the unsaved. Right? When you encounter the unsaved, you throw the fruit of the Spirit at them. Or blow them up with vials of God's wrath. At which point, they repent, drop to their knees, convert, and disappear. There's something about that game that encapsulates for me everything wrong with the American evangelical Christianity I grew up in. And I say this as someone who still proudly identifies as an American evangelical Christian. So I'm not here to bash evangelicalism. I'm not here to bash Christianity. I identify as both. But that's not the gospel. Throwing the fruit of the Spirit at people and expecting them to convert and disappear is not the gospel. And yet that's kind of the way I approached my faith as a teenager. And when I first heard about this controversial issue of homosexuality, that was kind of my approach. I need to throw the truth, lovingly throw the truth at people, tell them how wrong they are, and then they will change their minds, because I don't want them to go to hell. There were some controversies in my high school. People started talking a lot about this issue of homosexuality. We weren't quite informed enough to be talking about bi or trans folks. We're mostly talking about gay people. But as far as I knew everything that I needed to know, which was that being gay was a choice, it was a sin, and it was my job to speak out against it. And that's probably where things would have ended, with my saying, hey, love the sinner and hate the sin, and hate it very vocally so people know that it's a sin. That's probably where my story would have ended were it not for the fact that God slapped me upside the head. Because you see, and I'm sure this is not going to be a new story for many of you, when I hit puberty and my guy friends were starting to notice girls for the first time, right? And you know what I mean, like notice girls. Like they used to have cooties and then all of a sudden they had boobs. And am I allowed to say that in here? Is that all right? I was having the opposite experience. I was starting to notice guys. And I didn't know why, because, my nickname in high school was God Boy. God Boy is not supposed to be attracted to guys. That doesn't happen. And I kept convincing myself that as long as I trusted God and continued as a Christian, continued in my walk with Jesus, that this was going to go away. These feelings would go away. It was a phase. It was just some weird part of puberty. It was a temptation. It was something that as long as I didn't let it become my identity, it would go away. And it got to the point that I was praying constantly. I tried ignoring it. That didn't work. I tried praying constantly. I was crying myself to sleep night after night, begging God, please don't let me feel this way anymore. And nothing helped. There's a lot I could tell you about that, but I'm sure for many of you this is an old story, so I won't bore you with all the details. But I even ended up looking into what they call ex-gay ministries, trying to become straight, and that didn't work either. It wasn't until I was 18 that I even was able to use the word gay for myself. Because until then, I just thought this was some weird thing I was dealing with, but I certainly wasn't gay. And suddenly it dawned on me, oh, there's a word for guys who are attracted to guys, and that word is gay. But even then it was like a diagnosis of a disease. It was like, you have these weird symptoms, and you don't know what to do, and you go to one doctor after another, and they say, I don't know what's wrong, and then finally a doctor says, I know what's wrong. I know what you have. Here's the diagnosis. Here's the name of the disease you have. And even if it's a terrible disease, there's some sense of relief in finally knowing that you're not alone, that you're not the only person in the world who's experienced this, that you're not crazy. There's a name for this. And that's kind of what it was like for me. But even then I was like, I'm going to become straight. It's going to happen. Only it didn't. And I went off to college having realized I was gay and Christian and not knowing what to do about all of this, and I began to talk slowly to the Christians I respected in my life, my parents and my friends and my pastors and Christian leaders, youth group leaders, and so forth. And over and over and over and over again, the response I got was not great, let's put it that way. There's an episode of South Park, the first season of South Park, where Stan finds out that his dog Sparky is gay. And he doesn't want Sparky to be gay, and so he sits him down and he starts training him, and he's like, okay, Sparky, shake. Oh, no, first he says, sit, good boy. Now, shake, good boy. Now, don't be gay. Don't be gay, Spark, don't be gay. And Sparky just kind of goes, "Rrr." And Kyle says, did it work? And Cartman, who always has the best line, says, he still looks pretty gay to me. And that was kind of the experience I had with the church. Don't be gay. Okay, well, I am gay. Well, just don't be gay. Okay, how? Where's the switch? Tell me that. I got involved in a Christian ministry on my campus. And this particular ministry was fairly conservative, but it was a ministry that I agreed with in just about every way, theologically. But the news got around that I was gay. Because in church circles, we're very good at gossip. We just call it prayer circles, right? So the news got around that I was gay, and pretty soon there was a husband and wife team who led this ministry, and the husband invited me to lunch, and I was like, oh, this is nice, the head of this large Christian group is inviting me to lunch. He knows that I'm gay, and now he wants to get to know me. This is a really great opportunity. So I go to lunch, and we sit down, and he starts with small talk. How's life? How are classes? How are things going? And, we talk a little bit. And then he pulls out this big, thick Bible and just drops it on the table, and he's like, Justin, I'd like to hear your response to a few Bible passages. Oh, this is one of those talks. And so he flipped to a passage, and he's saying, here in Leviticus, it says a man should not lie with a man as with a woman. What do you say to that? I'm not lying with anyone. I'm single. Before I could even get a sentence out, he was already turning to the next passage. 1 Corinthians 6:9 says, and so on and so forth. I went home from that meeting and cried alone in my dorm room because I felt so devalued as a person. I thought, this guy doesn't want to get to know me. None of these Christians who have been my people my whole life, none of them, all of a sudden, none of them really want to know me, the real me, what I've been going through, what my story is. They want to preach at me and call that dialogue. And I don't want to be preached at anymore. There's a lot of pain for LGBT people in the country, in the world, and in particular in the church right now, which is not the way it should be. And sometimes when you're hurting, when you're in pain, Christians are really bad at dealing with pain, too. Have you noticed? Sometimes. Some Christians are wonderful. But they're the Christians who try to, when you're hurting from something bad is happening in your life, not to mention something bad at the hands of the church, but just anything bad is happening in your life. And you've got Christians who will try to smooth it over, your Christian friends who say, oh, just give it to God. Let me tell you something. The next time I'm hurting and a Christian says to me, just give it to God, I'm going to punch them in the face. And if they say, ow, that hurts, I'll say, well, give it to God. I do not actually advocate punching people in the face. I run an organization that has people who are in full support of not only LGBT inclusion in the church, but in full support of same-sex marriage, full support of LGBT people's relationships, gender identities, and so forth. But that also has folks who do not share all of those views. There are members of our organization who believe, for instance, that sex ought to be for marriage between a man and a woman. And we live in the midst of this tension that exists throughout the church. And I ultimately came to the conclusion that it's my obligation as a Christian to speak out in full support of marriage for all couples. And I hope to find the right guy someday and get married myself. But I also recognize that my brothers and sisters do not all share that view. And for many of us, in the LGBT community, whatever our theological views on these things, and for many of us who have friends who are LGBT and we've seen them hurt by the church, it's hard to get past the fact that wrong has been done. We see that significant wrong has been done. And we have to decide what our response to that wrong is going to be. And some folks say, well, as Christians, we're called to be merciful and forgiving, to love those who hurt us. Others say, as Christians, we are called to be bold and to seek justice for the oppressed. And my question is, well, what does Jesus say? What would Jesus do? Remember those old WWJD bracelets? Some of you do. WWJD, what would Jesus do? I had a friend who had a bag that said WWJDFAKB. I said, what's that mean? What's that mean? What would Jesus do for a Klondike bar? I don't know. When people wronged him, Jesus was meek. He turned the other cheek. He allowed himself to be put to death. When people in power used it to harm others, Jesus was bold. He turned over the tables of the money changers who were taking advantage of people and preventing the Gentiles from having a space to worship at the temple. He called the Pharisees sons of hell for the way that they, as he put it, shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. That said, we are not Jesus, so I don't recommend turning over pews, for instance. But I do believe that with individuals, we must be merciful. And with institutions, we must be bold. But in all things, we must exude grace. That is our calling as Christians, regardless of our views on marriage from a civil standpoint, from a theological standpoint, regardless of our understandings of gender and sexuality, we as Christians are called to be people of grace. It's easy to take a stand without grace. We see it all the time in our culture. And the government was shut down recently because our politicians are very good at taking stands and not very good at showing grace. Have you noticed? That's the way the world works. Taking a stand without grace is easy, and it often leads to a standoff. Because everyone has an opinion. Are you a Republican or are you a Democrat? Was that movie Gravity genius, or was it overhyped? Who should really have won on RuPaul's Drag Race? The world loves to take stands, and as Christians, we sometimes need to take stands as well. We often do. Jesus did, but we should do it with grace, and yet we often don't. There's an old, well-traveled joke many of you have probably heard. Every time I tell it, I like to change it up just a little bit. About a motorist who's driving down the road and he sees a guy standing on the side of a bridge getting ready to jump. And he dashes out of his car and runs over to this guy. And he says, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, don't do it, don't do it." And the guy says, "Why? I have nothing to live for." And the motorist says, "Sure you do. Don't you believe in God?" And the jumper says, "Well, actually, yes, I do." And the motorist says, "Well, me too. What is your religious background?" And the jumper says, "Well, I'm a Christian." And the motorist says, "Well, so am I. What denomination do you belong to?" And the jumper says, "Well, I'm a Baptist, actually." And the motorist says, "Well, so am I. We've got something in common, brother. Tell me, what sect of Baptist are you? Are you Southern, Northern, American?" He says, "Well, I'm a Southern Baptist." And the motorist says, "Well, so am I. Get out of town." tell me, which Southern Baptist are you? Which sort? And he says, well, actually, I'm with a small sect. We're the reorganized Southern Baptists. And he says, you're kidding me. I am too. Huh. So tell me, are you reorganized Southern Baptist Church of God or reorganized Southern Baptist Church of the Lord? Well, he says, I'm reorganized Southern Baptist Church of God. No way! I am too. What are the odds? Are you reorganized Southern Baptist Church of God 1932 assembly, or are you reorganized Southern Baptist Church of God 1956 assembly? And the guy says, well, I'm reorganized Southern Baptist Church of God 1956 assembly. And the motorist says, die, heretic, and pushes him off the bridge. So we Christians preach the fruit of the Spirit, but sometimes we end up throwing it at people. The organization I work for, as I said, the Gay Christian Network, has folks who disagree. This is from one of our recent conferences. We have a conference every January. The next one is coming up this coming January in Chicago. Rachel Held Evans will be one of our keynote speakers, in case you're interested. And in my work with the Gay Christian Network, I travel around the country and I give presentations to groups of conservative Christians about how to speak to and have conversation with LGBT folk. I give presentations to non-religious LGBT folk about how to speak to and have conversations with conservative Christians. I give presentations to folks who are groups that are pretty evenly divided in terms of people's theological views on these kinds of things. This group, I suspect, leans a particular way, given the title of the conference here, with LGBT Christians Speak Out. But I want to talk tonight about how we can have more gracious conversations in a way that takes a stand, makes a difference, and respects both ourselves and those who disagree with us. Because that's the tough thing, isn't it? When I talk about having conversation, especially when I talk to LGBT groups about having conversations, having dialogue with folks who disagree with them, some folks are really resistant. Actually, some folks on the other side are really resistant to this as well. And I don't blame them, because much of the conversation in the church, quote unquote, is really monologue, isn't it? You ever have somebody say to you, hey, we need to talk. And what they really mean is, hey, I need to talk. You need to listen to me, right? A lot of the dialogue we're invited to have is really monologue, where we're getting talked at, or it's dialogue that is so open that it robs us of the ability to take stands. Have you been invited to these kinds of conversations, where you have conversations about the importance of having conversations about conversations? Everyone's right. Everyone's opinion is equally valid. You ever see Fiddler on the Roof? There's that scene where Tevye is listening to these two Jewish scholars argue, and one of them makes a point, and Tevye says, oh, he's right. And then the other one makes the opposing point, and Tevye says, oh, he's right. And a third onlooker says, wait a minute, he is right and he is right? They can't both be right. And Tevye thinks for a minute and says, you know, you are also right. You know, sometimes when we have these conversations, these dialogues, where we say, oh, we're not going to judge each other. This is a safe space for everyone to have their opinion. Part of what I think people are sometimes afraid of when they hear that I have this organization with folks who disagree with each other is we end up with this kind of wishy-washy, you can't take a stand, you can't actually have an opinion because everyone's opinion is equally valid. And that's, well, I can't say what it is in here, but that's not real, right? I mean, if you're talking about what's your favorite flavor of ice cream, then that's okay. If you're talking about what's your favorite flavor of ice cream, then everyone's opinion is equally valid. Unless you choose butter pecan, in which case you're wrong and you're going to hell. But I'm just kidding. But you probably are. So, The reality is, on an issue, like when we're talking about our lives, when we're talking about people's lives and people's relationships, and we're talking about how we understand the Bible and how we understand our faith and what does God think and what's the right thing to do in society and what's the right thing to do in the church, if you have an opinion, then you believe that the people who disagree with you are wrong and you want to change their minds. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with that, because if you believe that people are wrong and that people are teaching and doing something wrong, you should want to change their minds. That makes sense. So when I talk about having a conversation, let me assure you right now, I'm not saying everyone's opinion is equally valid. I'm saying, let's talk about how you can change the minds of the people you think are wrong and do it in a way that's gracious. So here are 5 tips from me to you for having conversation that is gracious and can change minds. First, you've got to define what you mean by conversation. Because you see, just as many of us may be reluctant to enter a conversation if we think that people are just asking us to believe everyone is equally right, which is ridiculous, folks who disagree with us don't want us to ask that of them either, because they think that they're right and that we are wrong. Whatever you believe and whoever the other people are, they think that you are wrong if you think that they are wrong. So we need to say up front, look, I'm going to have a conversation with you about this. I would like us to have a dialogue, and let's just agree up front that we both think that each other is wrong and would like to change each other's minds. And that's okay. We still want to be gracious about it. The problem is then after we agree on that, where we a lot of times go is this idea that each of us now is going to argue for our own side. I'll argue for my side, you argue for your side, and there's actually a word for that, and it is debate. And so we end up in a debate, or worse, an argument, right? This does not change people's minds, though, does it? I mean, have you noticed? Have you ever been in the middle of a heated argument with someone, and they made a good point, and suddenly you're like, oh, never mind. If so, you're a better person than I. I don't know about you. If I'm in an argument and somebody makes a good point, I will not acknowledge it as a good point. I will try to figure out some way to prove that they're wrong. The thing is, the problem with debate is that I come into a debate with you with this brilliant point, a series of brilliant points. I've spent so much time working out these brilliant points to prove to you how wrong you are, right? And so it's my turn to talk, and I start making these brilliant points at you. What are you thinking about the whole time that I'm talking? You're thinking about your rebuttal, aren't you? You're thinking about how you're going to poke holes in everything I'm saying. You're not really listening to see if there's anything that I might say that might resonate with you. Your focus is on proving me wrong, because that's how debates work. Now, debates are great if you have 2 people up on a stage debating with each other and then you're the audience listening, right? Because then you can hear whose argument has more merit, or who at least is a better debater. But when you are debating with the person whose mind you're trying to change, you're not changing their mind, you're just causing them to dig their heels in further, and they are doing the same to you. So I think one of the things we have to focus on in having a conversation that's going to change minds is to build a relationship. Now, this is a little bit counterintuitive, because we think, well, wait, if I'm just focusing on a relationship, I'm not focusing on changing their minds. How can I change their minds if I'm not arguing with them? I'm so worried. What this really is about is taking more interest in the person than in the position. Here's why. Someone who takes more interest in your position on something than in you as a person is a salesperson, right? That's the annoying person who comes up to you in the store and tries to get you to buy whatever it is that they're hawking. Or the telemarketer who calls you up and says, hi, how are you today? And you say, fine, and they don't really care. They just want to tell you about whatever it is that they're selling today. And you're like, wait, I'm sure I'm on the do not call registry. How did you get my number? Someone who's more interested in your position than in you as a person is a salesperson. Someone who's more interested in you as a person than in your position, even though they disagree with you on some things, they put your relationship first, is your friend, right? This is the person who's like, even though you are totally wrong about this thing that I care about, I still love you and I care about you, and let's go to lunch and we'll stop talking about politics or RuPaul or whatever, right? That's your friend. Now, when it comes time to reevaluate your strongly held belief on something because something makes you question it, whose opinion matters more to you, your friend or a salesperson? Relationships change minds, but it's hard work. So it's important to take more interest in the person in the position and to say up front, this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to have a conversation where we're actually listening to each other and getting to know each other as people. But let's say up front we agree that we're both going to disagree right now. The second thing you've got to do is you've got to define your terms. We forget to do this, but it's important, and I'll show you why. Because last year, GCN finished up a college tour. We went to 20 different colleges, many of them in more conservative parts of the country. Not all of them, though, but many of them in more conservative parts of the country. Because we really wanted to know, some of these more conservative students, these more conservative Christian students, what's going on in the walls that they're running into when they're talking to their LGBT friends, and the walls their LGBT friends are running into when they're trying to talk to them. So we did a survey on these campuses, and we asked them questions and gave them the chance to agree or disagree. So for instance, we gave them statements that you often hear on both sides of this. So this is one of them, homosexual behavior is a sin. Now let me just say right up front, I don't use the phrase homosexual behavior. I think it's a terrible phrase, but it's a phrase we hear a lot, right, in this conversation. So this is kind of how this study was set up. So we asked all the students on these campuses, what do you think, is this true or not? Now keep in mind, this is mostly in the South, mostly in more evangelical parts of the country. And the students overall who took the survey, this was not a random sample, this was a convenience sample, they were pretty well split down the middle. That doesn't really tell us anything other than who took the survey. It was pretty much biased towards folks who have strong views on both sides. So we said, let's look at the folks who have the strongest view that yes, it is sinful. We called them the conservative Christian group, specifically Christians in this group. So we said, well, what do you conservative, and specifically we looked at self-identified straight conservative Christians. Straight conservative Christians, do you think people can choose whether they're gay or straight? Most of the questions on this particular study were about gay folks. There were a couple that had to do with bi and trans issues, but mostly we were talking about gay issues. But a lot of the ideas here will carry over. But I just want to make a point about terminology here, is why I'm showing you this. So we said, do you think people can choose whether they're gay or straight? Among these straight conservative Christian students, about 2/3 of them said yes, that people choose whether they're gay. And we said, well, do you think some people might be born gay? Some people, not all people, but might some people be born gay? The straight conservative Christians overwhelmingly disagreed. Over half of them strongly disagreed. So they felt very strongly about this. Now notice, this is not a theological question. This is not a question about do you support gay marriage? Do you think that gay sex is sinful or not? This is a question about how does the world work, right? Do you think that people are born gay or not? This is an open question. Do you think it's true or not? Compare this to LGBT respondents on this same question. Overwhelmingly, the LGBT students said, yeah, I think that some people are born gay. Now, the point here is not about whether or not people are born gay. The point is really about the fact that when these two groups of people start to have a conversation about sexual orientation, not to mention gender identity, right off the bat, they're beginning with two very different sets of assumptions about how the world works, right? This is important to know if you're going to have a conversation with somebody. There are a few other things, like we said, do you think people can change their orientation? And overwhelmingly, the straight conservative Christians said yes. Only 5% disagreed with this statement on these particular campuses. So then we asked something really bizarre. I said, let's ask something really out there and just see if anyone will say yes to this. Do you think, because most of the debate in the church on the conservative side has to do with sex, right? Like on the progressive side, we talk a lot about relationships. On the conservative side, a lot of the conversation is about sex. So I said, okay, let's take sex out of the equation. Is it a sin for someone to be gay if they commit themselves to lifelong celibacy, if they don't ever have sex? I wanted to see if any of the straight conservative Christians would say yes to this, and over half of them did. Right? Now, this got me thinking, because this is kind of weird theologically. Like, as a born and bred evangelical, I mean, I was raised with the clear understanding there's a difference between temptation and sin. So if gay sex is sin, then being attracted to somebody of the same sex would be a temptation, right? So what's going on here? Like, you wouldn't call temptation sin. So I began to suspect part of the issue is we're not defining our terms the same way. So I said, okay, let me give you a hypothetical scenario. Let's say we've got a guy named John. He's attracted to men, but he's married to a woman, and he's faithful to his wife. What is his sexual orientation? The LGBT respondents to the survey overwhelmingly said either he's gay or he's bi. Some folks said, well, he's gay. You know, he's attracted to men, he's gay. Some folks said, well, from the wording of the question, it sounds to me like he might be attracted to men and women, so I would say he's bi. Some folks specifically said, because there was a blank where you could put in your answer, you know, as well as make a choice. Some folks specifically said, well, you know, it's not clear from the question whether he's attracted to women, so I'm not sure if he's gay or bi, but he's one of those two. So about 3/4 of LGBT folks said he's gay or bi. And then we had another quarter who gave other answers, many of them along the lines of, you know what, I don't like to assign labels to other people. That's a very LGBT thing to say, isn't it? Like, I've had too many people try to label me. I am not going to try to label somebody else, even a fictional character in the story, you know? Which is fair. Which is fair. Here's the fun thing. Among the straight conservative Christians, a bunch of them also said he's gay or bi, but it was less than half, and 20% of them said he's straight. Not a single LGBT person ever called him straight. What's going on? We're using terms differently. We don't agree on what the words gay and straight even mean. So if you don't agree on what the terms mean, how can you have a conversation about the terms? How can you have a conversation that uses the terms unless you first define them and say, when I say I'm trans, here's what I mean. When I say I'm bi, here's what I mean. When I say I'm gay, here's what I mean. When I talk about my best friend who is a lesbian, here's what I mean by that word lesbian, right? We have to define our terms. Sometimes we can get the assumption, those of us who talk about this stuff a lot, can make the assumption that everybody knows, for instance, what LGBT means. I always explain to folks, it's a BLT with guacamole. It's very simple. We can assume that we all know what the word gay means, or that we all know what the word transgender means. Let me tell you, if people can't agree on what the word gay means, I guarantee you they do not know what the word transgender means. And it's easy, if you find yourself talking about this stuff all the flipping time, it's easy to not want to explain all over again, right? Particularly if you are trans and every time this conversation comes up, there are all these ridiculously personal, offensive questions. But we have to educate people if we're going to have helpful dialogue with them. A lot of straight conservative Christians I've met as I've traveled around the country don't even know, for instance, that many gay people, myself included, do not like the word homosexual. They don't know. And I say, you know, many gay people find this word offensive or at least outdated, and they're like, really? I thought I was being very loving when I said we should show more love to homosexuals. That doesn't come across as well as you're hoping. But they don't know. And so I can't be offended if somebody calls me a homosexual if I haven't taken the time to explain to them, hey, I actually prefer the term gay. Let me tell you why. Now, there are some Christians who know, by the way, that this is offensive. There was a Christian, very political group that for a while was posting, they were taking news stories from the Associated Press and reposting them on their website. Anything that had the word gay in it got reposted on their website. And they had a computer program that changed the word gay to homosexual every time automatically. just to, you know? Because they knew that gay people prefer the term gay by and large, and so they intentionally changed it from gay to homosexual. This backfired a little bit when their computer picked up a story about sprinter Tyson Gay. Resulting in this headline. Homosexual eases into 100 final at Olympic trials. On Saturday, homosexual misjudged the finish in his opening heat and had to scramble to finish fourth. And while we're at it, a lot of folks don't stop to do this, but I always say, anytime you get the chance to do this, please do. When somebody uses the word homosexuality, stop them and say, what do you mean by homosexuality? Because here's the thing. If you think people can't agree on what the word gay means, they surely don't know what they mean by homosexuality. Because people say homosexuality, well, do you think homosexuality is a sin? And what they think they're talking about is, like a sex act that they have in mind. And I always have to stop and say, okay, well, does your church teach that sex before marriage is sinful? And usually the answer is yes. And I say, okay, do you think heterosexuality before marriage is a sin? And it's when they stop and go, oh, that is kind of a really vague term, isn't it? Because, like the 12-year-old girl who realizes that there's a cute boy in her class, that's heterosexuality before marriage. There are couples in your church going on dates, heterosexuality before marriage. Right? Because shockingly, even though I don't like the word homosexual, I am homosexual all the time. I'm homosexual right now. In front of an audience. Like, this is a word that could mean sex. It could refer to sexual behavior. It can refer to dates. It can refer to relationships. It can refer to attractions. It can refer to a person. Like, it's such a vague term. And this is the problem, that we're not clear. So I say, please don't ever use this term. If you want to say gay sex, just say gay sex. I always have to include this slide so that I can speak to church crowds and have gay sex on the slide in front of them. All right, 3 more things you have to do, and these I'm going to go through fairly quickly. The third one is share stories. Because here's the thing. We end up having arguments, don't we? Thanks. We end up having arguments a lot, right? You start a conversation and it ends in an argument, right? People cannot argue with your story. You have a story. If you are gay or bi or trans, or queer, genderqueer, however you identify, you have a story. If you're part of the LGBT, TSIQQ, whatever community, you have a story. If you are a straight person who cares about LGBT people, you have a story about why you care, about the person who came out to you, who changed the way you saw things, or the time that you were in church and you had a revelation about, or whatever, whoever you are, you've got a story. And your story is something nobody can take away from you. Nobody can argue with your story. And if we focus on stories, it helps us get away from just the arguments. Because the arguments don't change minds, but stories do. My story is in my book. And my book is not just my story, but there's a lot of my story interwoven throughout. And I've had a lot of folks who completely disagree with me say, wow, this changed the way I see things, because I've never read a story like this. And I'm thinking, really? Because I hear these stories every day. I am the executive director of the Gay Christian Network, but, there are lots of these stories out there. How many of you have seen the film E.T.? Yes. Right, okay. How do you feel about aliens coming to Earth after you see E.T.? Pretty good, right? E.T.'s awesome. Who wouldn't love E.T.? If you don't like E.T., you're going to hell with the butter pecan people. So E.T. is awesome. So imagine we found out that there were actual extraterrestrial aliens coming to Earth right now. And you're all excited, and you're like, oh my gosh, this is going to be awesome. We can learn about completely different cultures that are not of Earth. We can expand our understanding of the universe that God created and all of this stuff. This is going to be amazing. And your neighbor is like, oh no, bring out the guns, bring out the military. Let's tell these aliens we do not want them here. What's going on? There are lots of things that might be going on, but what if your neighbor has never seen E.T., but he has seen Independence Day or War of the Worlds or V or something, right? This is his image of aliens coming to Earth. This is a gut thing, right? When you see this gives you a gut reaction about what it's going to be like, and it's scary. You will not change your neighbor's view if this is what's in their mind by arguing. You cannot make a good enough theological argument, philosophical argument, constitutional argument, legal argument. No matter how great your argument is, they're going to be going, yeah, Jesus said to love, sure, yeah, but I don't want to get blown up. What you have to do is introduce your neighbor to new stories about these aliens, like E.T. Right? You guys are just trying to not go to hell, I know. What often happens is, I find that when I start telling my story, sometimes people want to interrupt me and argue about the Bible. It's like, and I'm telling my story and I'm like, and I realized I was gay and this was a real struggle, and they're like, yeah, but 1 Corinthians says, and Romans says, and Leviticus says, and whatever. And it's really easy because I've studied those passages too, and I believe in the Bible, and I love the Bible. It's really easy for me to want to slip into, let's debate about the Bible, because I've got great arguments. But as soon as you start arguing with somebody, I don't care what side you're on, as soon as you start arguing the Bible with somebody, you've lost them, because you're not going to change their mind by arguing. I believe the Bible is critical. I believe the Bible is important, and the Bible is at the center of many of the conversations we have on this subject. But it's not helpful when it comes to trying to have good, respectful dialogue, especially in the early stages. Here's what it feels like. Now, I have to tell you in advance, this is a video about ducks, about ducklings. They're okay. I tell you because I don't want you to worry, because it's funny, but if you're worried about them, then you won't be able to see that it's funny, okay? Some of you are not going to think it's funny anyway, but it's funny. Because they're okay in the end. Because I feel like one of these baby ducks, when I'm going along and I'm starting to share my story, I'm talking to this person, and then here comes their Bible arguments. And then some more. And it keeps on coming. And that's how I feel. That's me right there, going, what just happened? Blown off course. But you go back, and you get back in line, and you continue telling your story and asking about their story. Focus on sharing stories. If you want to have good dialogue, focus on the stories. And when somebody says to you, here's what I do. When somebody says to me, in the middle of my story, they say, well, but what do you say up to 1 Corinthians 6:9? Here's what I say. I say something, depending on the context, I say something like this. I say, you know what, that was a passage that I really struggled with growing up. Because I was discovering this about myself, and then, I was reading this, and I was like, well, what is this saying about me, and what does my future mean? Let me tell you how I ultimately came to the conclusions that I finally did. And I go back to telling my story. I pivot from Bible argument to, let's talk about our stories. Because at the end of the conversation, I may not have changed this person's mind about what a particular Bible passage means, but hopefully I will have let them see me as a person and given them the chance to share their story so I can see them as a person too, not just as someone who disagrees with me, not just as an obstacle. Because ultimately what you really want to do is to find the overlap. To figure out, hey, you and I may not agree on how to interpret 1 Corinthians 6:9, but maybe we can both agree that if somebody feels all alone in this church or on this campus or feels that the church doesn't love them or that God doesn't love them or they're getting bullied or any of these things, hopefully you and I can agree that that's a bad thing and that we should stop it. So how do we do that? Well, we need to talk, we need to understand each other, and then we need to take action. There's an overlap in almost any situation. It requires, though, what Stephen Covey said, seek first to understand, then to be understood. Listen to the other person. Let them share their story. Let them talk and talk and talk until they've said everything they can say, and the only thing left for them to do is say, why don't you tell me what you think and what you've been through? Because the more you understand, the better you can find that overlap, and the better you can focus on the other person's needs. And this is tough because people are like, well, wait a second. I don't want to talk about their needs. We've talked about their needs until we're blue in the face. It is time for them to focus on my needs. Yes, it is. But you can't make them do it. And the only way that you're going to get close is by listening to them and showing them the grace that they haven't shown you. This is one of those deceptive things, you know? The weak are the strong, the last shall be first, the meek will inherit the earth. Focusing on their needs helps bring them around to your needs, more times than not. There's a famous story of two people fighting over whether a window should be open or shut. And one of them gets up and opens the window, and she sits down. And then the other one gets up and he closes the window, and he sits down. And she gets back up and she opens it, and he gets back up and he closes it. And she turns to him, she says, look, I want the window open. And he says, well, I want it closed. And she says, I want it open. And he says, I want it closed. And they says, argue back and forth. You can argue back and forth like that forever, until finally you say, well, why? Why? What is it from your perspective that's so important about having the window open? Well, it's stuffy in here. I want air. It's hot. The breeze feels nice. Why do you want it shut so badly? Well, because every time you open the window, it's blowing the papers off my desk. I'm trying to work. Okay. If I understand the why, if I understand what's going on, what it is that you need, then maybe we can find some overlap. Maybe there's a way to cool off the room and not blow papers off your desk. Everyone is the protagonist of their own story. When you have a conflict with somebody and you tell the story, you're the good guy, right? They're the bad guy. Most of the time when you tell the story, you didn't do anything wrong. But if you ever do admit that you did anything wrong, there were always extenuating circumstances. Right? Because if you cut somebody else off in traffic, you know it was an accident. You know that you were in a hurry and you were having a terrible day and all of these things were going on and you were just flustered. That doesn't reflect on you, that reflects on your situation. That jerk who just cut you off in traffic, they're a terrible driver and a terrible person, and you should blow your horn loudly at them. When other people tell the story of their conflict with you, they are the protagonist. That's how they see it. And until you learn to see it from their perspective, you won't learn what it is you need to do to get them to see it from your perspective. Because everyone's got a dilemma. For me, I always say to conservative Christian audiences, the dilemma I have as a gay person in the church is not, should I be gay or not? I already am gay. My dilemma is, now what? Now, what does this look like for me to be involved in this church? Now, how do I live my life? Now, is the church going to give me any help? For someone who disagrees with me, the question may be, hey, I've read the Bible over and over on this, and I can't seem to come around to seeing it the way you do, but I want to love you. How do I do that? And I need to be willing to talk to them from that perspective. At the end, he and his wife were promoted, and so the next year a new couple came in to lead the group. And this new couple had not been there for long before they heard the news that I was gay, prayer circles and all that. And once again, the husband invited me to lunch. And this time I thought, I'm coming prepared. And so I put my Bible in my backpack and I spent time standing in the mirror rehearsing my speeches and my sound bites, my response to any passage he could possibly bring up, any question he could possibly ask. And I went to lunch and I sat there stiff as a board while he started with the same old, how's life, how are classes, how are things, all the small talk. Fine, fine, fine. Halfway through lunch, he still hadn't gotten around to it, and so finally, I just said, look, dude, what do you want? What did you want to talk about? And he's like, what do you mean? I said, look, we're half out of time, we don't have much time left. If you want to talk about something, let's talk about it. You invited me to lunch. What do you want to talk about? And he just looked at me and he said, I'm new to the group. You're very active in the group. I just wanted to get to know you. Okay. I had been so hurt by people like him that even when he was trying to do the right thing, I wasn't ready to let him do it because I wasn't ready to sit down and have a dialogue. Sometimes it's easy to get all of our emotional armor on when we've been hurt, but I think it's worth continuing to find ways to show grace. Not to the extent that you're putting yourself in emotional and spiritual jeopardy. I mean, you've got to take care of yourself. But it's worth recognizing that sometimes our past hurts interfere with our future ability to have dialogue. Because there is a lot to be done in the church. There is a lot of work that needs to happen, and there's a lot of dialogue that needs to happen. And the people in this room sharing your stories with folks who may not have heard them before can change the world. So I'm going to leave you with that. If you have questions, I will be happy to take them after because I don't have time to take them now, but I will hang around, so please feel free to come and ask me questions or ask me to sign books if you want to get my book. But I will tell you right now, you cannot beat the best question I've ever gotten, which was a couple weeks ago. I was speaking and people were writing their questions down because that's how they wanted to do it over at Calvin College. And we found one of these questions after everything was over, and this was it. Those of you who don't know why that's funny, ask someone younger than you. Thanks very much.